In this chapter, we're going to look at special senses. We've talked about the nervous system and the different branches of the nervous system. We've discussed general senses such as tactile and temperature and pressure and pain. So now we'll look at very specialized senses that detect very specialized stimuli. So the receptors for the special senses such as smell, taste, hearing, equilibrium or balance, and vision are very distinct receptors, and they're located in specific regions within the head. They usually lie within epithelial tissues that make up very complex sensory organs such as the eyes, ears, and nose, the taste buds. Special senses have a very low threshold, so it only takes a very small or very little stimulus to be detected. Some of the special senses, such as olfactory and hearing, can adapt very easily, so they learn to ignore certain stimuli. For instance, think about when you walk into a room and you smell a musty odor. So perhaps you left your towel lying on the floor. Well, if you stay in that room for a good period of time, you'll no longer smell that. Your olfactory nerve receptors have adapted to that sense of smell and tuned it out because it wasn't deemed important by you. As you're sitting there listening to my lecture, perhaps there are cars driving down the road outside your window, or your children are playing, or the television is on in another room. But if you're paying attention to the lecture, like good students, and you should be, right? If you're paying attention to what I'm saying and paying attention to your lecture content, the sound that you hear is my voice discussing special senses, not the television in the background or the cars out on the road. So even though that stimulus is being detected, it's not being processed, so those receptors have adapted and our brain has tuned that information out. So we'll begin first with the sense of smell. Smell is a chemical sense, and your receptors for the sense of smell are going to be located in the nose. So the mucous membranes of the nose have to house those receptors, and the chemicals that bind to those receptors must be dissolved in a liquid. So the mucus that covers your nasal membranes, your mucous membranes, will dissolve those chemicals, and therefore those chemicals can bind the receptors, and you have the sense of smell. You detect that odor. So the human nose contains 10 to 100 million receptors for the sense of smell, what we call olfaction. And those receptors, as I mentioned, are in that epithelial lining, the nasal mucosa that lines your nasal cavity. So that olfactory epithelial covers the surface of the nasal membrane. And it also covers the surface of the cribriform plate. Remember, that was in the ethmoid bone, so on each side of the cristagalli, right above your nose, so right where your eyebrows come together. And that cribriform plate had all the holes in it, so your olfactory nerve fibers are going to extend through the holes in the cribriform plate. And then, of course, they innervate that nasal mucosa that covers the nasal cavity and swirls around or covers those swirl-like bones called your nasal conchae, and that increases the surface area of the nasal membrane so that we can have a lot more receptors in that small space. Some interesting facts about the sense of smell is that women typically have a better sense of smell than men, and that increased sense of smell is even better near the time of ovulation each month when we release those egg cells for fertilization. There are certain things such as smoking that will temporarily decrease the sense of smell. A part of that is because of some of the chemicals and some of the things in cigarette smoke can coat that nasal membrane and sort of form a covering over those receptors. It can also damage some of the cell structures such as cilia and help to or prevent that sense of smell from being detected or those chemicals from getting to the receptors as readily. The good news is that function can be recovered because cells have a very limited lifespan, and when damaged cells die, wear out, or broken down in the body, they're replaced by new functional smells. So you can recover the sense of smell if it is just short-term damage due to smoking or some type of chemical damage like that. Another interesting fact, hyposomia, hypo meaning low, is where you have a reduced ability to smell. This affects about half the population in the world over the age of 65, and that percentage, of course, goes up as age goes up. This can be the result of simple aging and not replacing cells as efficiently as we do when we're young, or some type of neurological damage that might have damaged the nerve pathway. Other drugs, and of course, as we mentioned, cigarette smoke can also temporarily affect the sense of smell and result in a temporary hyposomnia. All right, so let's move on and look just briefly at the pathway for the sense of smell. So as I mentioned, the receptors are in the nasal mucosa, and they're going to detect those chemicals that come into the nasal cavity in the atmosphere that we breathe. Those receptors are going to be attached, of course, to olfactory sensory neurons that are going to be depolarized as those receptors are stimulated. So once those sensory neurons are depolarized, that information then is going to travel through those neurons in the form of an action potential or a nerve impulse into the brain, where we interpret the sense of smell. So the receptors bind the chemical, then that in turn depolarizes a sensory neuron. Those nerve fibers run through the cribriform plate into the olfactory bulb. Remember, that's cranial nerve number 1. Those impulses travel along the olfactory tract and into the primary olfactory area of the cortex, where we have a conscious awareness of smell, and we can discriminate between those thousands and thousands of chemical combinations that we interpret as the sense of smell. There are other axons associated with the sense of smell that are going to project to the limbic system, and remember, that's where our emotional response is going to be processed. So that's where we have that emotional reaction when we smell mom's apple pie or grandma's perfume, or something that causes us to have that emotional memory. All right, so there's a lot more to the sense of smell, but that's as deep as we're going to go into it, so make sure you understand the basics of it. And next we'll move into the sense of gustation or taste. So this, the sense of taste is also a chemical receptor, so it's a chemical sense, but it's much, much simpler than the sense of olfaction. So we can smell thousands of different odors and thousands of different combinations of chemicals, but taste only has 5 primary tastes. So we can only detect 5 primary tastes. Those tastes are salty, which detects the presence of sodium ions in food and a few other electrolytes. The taste of sour, which is produced by the presence of hydrogen ions in food. Remember, hydrogen ions are released from acids. So for instance, lemons contain citric acid. So that means that when in a solution, such as body fluids or saliva, those citric acids break down to release hydrogen ions, and that is what stimulates your sour taste buds. Your sweet taste reception is elicited by sugars such as glucose and fructose and sugars, and also artificial sweeteners such as saccharin and some of the others that are on the market now. Your bitter taste buds, let's think about that one for a minute. Does anybody really like bitter? Well, coffee is sort of bitter because of some of the chemicals in the coffee and the caffeine. But bitter is caused by a variety of substances, and it's one of those you might think of as a protective special sense, in that when the bitter taste buds are stimulated, the first impulse, the first time you taste something bitter, may be to spit it out. So caffeine, some drugs such as morphine, and some toxins such as the botulism toxin from spoiled food stimulate those bitter taste buds. And that should tell our body, ooh, get rid of this, spit it out, rather than swallowing it into the digestive system where it can get into the entire body. Now we have, of course, developed a taste or a tolerance, and even in some cases a very intense desire for bitter foods, such as those we find in caffeine and even dark chocolate. And then the fifth taste sensation is umami. So this was the most recently discovered by some Japanese scientists who found that the umami taste buds are stimulated by amino acids in food. So this is what we think of as our meaty or savory taste. Monosodium glutamate, which you may have heard of is simply called MSG, is a very common additive that enhances flavors of other foods. So this is added to certain dishes, especially in a lot of some of the Oriental types of cooking, Chinese cooking, and some of the others, some Thai and others. So the umami, of course, is very rich. Monosodium glutamate is very rich in amino acids, so that stimulates those taste buds. Now, what about everything else? What about chocolates and the taste of donuts, or the taste of green beans, or anything that doesn't just necessarily fit into one of these categories? Well, you were right when you thought, yeah, it's all just a combination. So we have the 5 primary tastes, and everything else is a combination of those 5 in some shape, form, or fashion. You may have also noticed that when you have a cold or a sinus infection or something causes your nose to be stopped up, that your sense of taste is not quite as strong as it is under normal conditions. The reason for that is when you put food into your mouth, some of those chemicals that break away and are a part of that food are going to pass from the posterior part of the mouth up into the nose, where it binds with some of those receptors in the nasal passages. Remember those olfactory receptors, and those are much more sensitive than the taste buds, so that enhances our taste. All right, so there's your intro. Let's look briefly at what's going on with the sense of taste, which we call gustation. So the receptors for taste are located in taste buds that are found in raised papillae, or little projections, primarily on the tongue, but also in certain other areas in the young adult, such as the soft palate, what we commonly call the pharynx or the throat, and a small amount may be also found on the epiglottis, the little flap that closes off our trachea. Taste buds consist of an oval body with 3 kinds of cells. Supporting cells surround the receptor cells. The receptor cells, of course, are going to bind to that chemical. And then you have basal stem cells. So stem cells just give us a constant replacement supply, because cells do wear out, cells do get broken down, cells do get damaged. So about 10 days is the normal lifespan for a taste cell, and so these basal stem cells allow for that replacement. This is why when you burn your tongue, you don't lose that particular area's reception for taste. Those cells are replaced very quickly. So chemical receptors for taste bind to chemicals, again, that are dissolved in a solution, such as the saliva in your mouth. You don't taste these chemicals unless they are dissolved in water. So if you want to try this and see just how true this is, take your tongue and stick it out and pat it dry with a paper towel. Pat it really dry with a paper towel and hold it. Keep it out. Don't let it go back in your mouth. If it goes back in, it's going to get wet again. Have someone take a few crystals of salt and a few crystals of sugar and put them on your tongue and see if you can tell the difference. Until it sits there for a few seconds, if your tongue was really dry, those chemicals are not going to be dissolved in a solution. No saliva present, right? So it's very difficult and takes some time for those chemical receptors to detect those tastes, because of the residual saliva begins to break down just a little bit of that salt or sugar. All right, so we have axons from 3 cranial nerves that innervate the taste buds. So from taste buds, nerve impulses propagate along these cranial nerves into different areas of the brain, such as the medulla and the limbic system and the hypothalamus and the thalamus, which directs signals. But it's when this information gets to the cerebral cortex, and especially to the primary gustatory area, we have conscious perception and awareness of this taste. So we become aware that the stimulus is there, and we recognize what it is because we've tasted that before. Or it may be something brand new, and we detect it, and we become aware of it, and we perceive that taste, and we decide that we like it. And so next time, of course, we're going to want more and more. Just a couple of quick disorders or clinical terms associated with the sense of taste. And one is taste aversion. So aversion means to turn away from something. So this occurs when people or even animals learn to avoid certain foods that have previously upset their digestive system. So it may just be that there is a memory of that previous upset experience where perhaps you developed diarrhea when you ate something, or something was spoiled and it made you throw up. So we develop an aversion to that called a taste aversion, so that we avoid that food. Ageusia, A-G-E-U-S-I-A, ageusia is a loss of the sense of taste. Now that may happen because of some type of damage, but there are also certain things such as chemotherapy and radiation treatments that are taken for certain types of cancers that can destroy that pathway and destroy those receptors as well. Now, if you do have destruction of the basal stem cells that are the source of those taste buds and those receptor cells, remember they're constantly making new cells. If the basal stem cells are destroyed, then you typically don't regain that sense of taste because there's nothing there to replace those damaged cells. And the last term I want to bring up is anosmia, A-N-O-S-M-I-A, and that is when you have a total lack of the sense of smell. Again, this can be due to some type of traumatic damage, or again, something such as chemotherapy or radiation that destroys those cells.